All right, let's jump right in. Have you ever thought about whether your country's economy could actually be affecting your neighbor's pollution? Or, get this, if their big push for green energy could somehow boost your economy? Well, today we're going to dig into a really cool study that found this hidden connection between countries. It's something we're calling the neighbor effect.
I mean, this is the question of our time, isn't it? On one hand, of course, we all want our economies to grow, we want more prosperity. But on the other hand, we know that historically, that growth has come at a huge environmental cost. So are these two things just fundamentally at odds? Or is there actually a way to have our cake and eat it too? That's what we're going to explore.
So, to get to the bottom of this, we've got to get to know the three main characters in this whole story. First up, you have economic growth, right? Usually we measure that with GDP. Think of it as the engine driving a country forward. Then you've got CO2 emissions, the pollution that's basically a byproduct of that engine. And finally, the potential hero, renewable energy, the green power that could change the entire game.
Okay, so here's where it gets interesting. These three things, they don't just exist on their own. Nope. They are constantly interacting, kind of pushing and pulling on each other in this really complex dance. And to really understand what's going on, we first need to talk about a key concept.
Let's talk about causality. And the easiest way to think about it is like traffic on a street. Sometimes it's a one-way street, right? More economic activity causes more pollution. Simple. A causes B. That's unidirectional. But what if it's a two-way street? What if more economic activity causes pollution, but then that pollution, by wrecking the environment, actually ends up hurting the economy? That's bidirectional. It's a feedback loop.
And this is precisely what the researchers behind this study argued. They basically said, look, you can't just look at these things one by one. It doesn't work. To get the real, full picture, you have to look at how all three, growth, pollution, and green energy, are all influencing each other at the exact same time.
So what they find? Well, inside a single country, they found it's all two-way streets. More economic growth leads to more emissions, but those emissions also impact growth. Growth drives the need for renewable energy, but renewables also help fuel the economy. And this is crucial. Higher emissions create a bigger push for renewables, while more renewables, of course, work to lower emissions. It is a totally interconnected feedback loop.
Okay, so you'd think each country is just in its own little self-contained bubble, right? A tangled mess for sure, but its own mess. What happens in Germany stays in Germany, what happens in Spain stays in Spain. You get the idea. But is that really how it works? This is where the whole story takes a really fascinating turn. Because this is where the researchers found something that just completely blows up those national bubbles. They uncovered some seriously compelling evidence for what they call spatial correlation, or as we're calling it, the neighbor effect. So, what exactly is this neighbor effect? Honestly, it's a pretty simple idea. It's just the fact that what happens in your backyard is probably influenced by what your neighbors are doing next door. And in this case, it means a country's economy, its pollution levels, and even its use of green energy. They're all connected to what its bordering countries are up to. You might be wondering, how on earth did they measure that? Well, they basically created a neighbor map. The technical term is a spatial weights matrix, but all it really is a way to tell their computers which countries share a border. And that lets them statistically measure if a trend in one country is spilling over the fence into the next one. So the researchers took this method and they applied it to a ton of data, 21 European Union countries over a 20-year period, from 1995 to 2014. And the patterns they found? Well, they were impossible to ignore. Let's take a look.
Check this out. This map shows economic growth back in 2014. See the red areas? Those are high-growth countries, and they're right next to other high-growth countries. You can see right away that prosperity isn't just random. It clumps together. It clusters.
Okay, now let's look at the map for CO2 emissions from that same year. See that? The pattern is almost identical. The red clusters of high pollution are sitting right on top of those clusters of high economic growth. It's pretty clear, just like wealth, pollution does not care about lines on a map.
And here it is, the final piece of the puzzle, renewable energy. And, would you look at that? Same story. The red clusters show us that when one country starts going green, its neighbors are way more likely to do the same. The solution, just like the problem, spreads from neighbor to neighbor.
So, just how strong is this neighbor effect? This chart from 2014 gives us the score. A higher number means a stronger spillover. And you can see that economic growth has the biggest effect by far. But look at renewable energy. It's right behind it.
Even CO2 has a pretty significant clustering effect.
So the huge, critical takeaway here is this. What happens in one country does not stay in that country. These economies, these environmental policies, they aren't isolated islands. They are deeply, deeply interconnected with their neighbors. The choices a country makes, for better or worse, are absolutely going to spill over its borders.
Now, this whole discovery, it's not just some interesting fact for a science journal. It has massive implications for how we need to think about tackling our biggest global challenges. For policymakers, this really changes the entire game.
So, what does this all mean for the real world? Well, for one, it means that a purely national policy is basically a fantasy. Every single economic or environmental decision a country makes is going to have international ripple effects. It means that problems like pollution will always spill over, but so will the solutions, like adopting green tech. So, the most effective way forward? It has to be coordinated, regional action. Countries working together are just way more powerful than countries trying to go it alone.
And, the researchers themselves really hit the nail on the head. They conclude that getting this right, really understanding these complex connections, is absolutely essential if we want to create policies that actually work, policies that can grow our economies and protect our shared planet. And that really leaves us with one last big question to think about, doesn't it? If borders can't stop pollution and they can't stop economic influence, then in a world this connected, what does a truly national policy even mean for our shared future?